Welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. My name is Austin Chadwick and co-host is Chris Lucian. And today, definitely very excited to have Matt Wynne on the show. We got some excellent topics lined up, and I'm excited to get into it. We got TDD, BDD, mobbing, vulnerability at work, inclusivity, open source mobbing, and we'll see where we get to. But before we jump into those topics, Matt, can you introduce yourself for us, please?
Sure, yeah. So I'm 46 years old now. I've been programming for a living for 25 years. And I first got into, I sort of started sneaking Agile into work, Agile practices into work in about 2001. I once got fired for doing test-driven development because I was taking too long. Right now, about 10 years ago, I got involved in the Cucumber open source project. So Cucumber is a tool for writing business readable acceptance tests. So you can write a kind of documentation, specification document that anybody can read, and you can run it as an automated test. I got involved in that project about 10 years ago and ended up like writing a book and then starting a company. And then we sold the company to SmartBear. So now I work for SmartBear, and my job there is I am a BDD advocate, and I'm also the co-lead with Aslak Helasoy of the Cucumber open source project.
Fantastic. That's a great intro. I've had some wonderful experiences with Cucumber in the past and BDD, so that's a good thing. So TDD, BDD, and mobbing. So what's your thoughts here?
Well, I often say, you can prize TDD from my cold, dead hands as a practice. Like I'm not like one of these annoying evangelical people. I don't think there's any moral imperative to writing quality code. But if you want to keep the code, and actually sometimes even if you don't, like, I don't know any better way of writing it. And I think our industry is still in a place where another metaphor for TDD I think about is like a spirit level for construction, right? Like it's perfectly possible to put together a shack in your backyard without a spirit level. And people did that kind of stuff for centuries and got by okay. But if you want to put a high-rise building together, you need to better set levels, right? And I think TDD is a practice like that for constructing software. I think that you can get away without it and you can put together the equivalent of a shack in the backyard. But if you're not figuring it out and learning how to do it, eventually you're building something that's going to be a mess. And I think every software developer ought to learn it and figure out where it fits and doesn't fit in their day-to-day work. And it's a great source of mystery and intrigue to me why it's taking so long to spread as a practice around the industry, really. I think it's fascinating because there's such a lot of dynamics to that problem, the social side of it and the pressures that capitalism puts on us to rush around knocking out features. I think it's fascinating.
I have a theory around I think it all kind of starts in school, actually, a lot of the time, because one aspect of it that I think people don't consider a lot is that when people are going through university, they have projects, but a lot of the time the code only lasts for 6 months and then it never goes away. And so no one experiences the pain of working in a project that falls over after 5 years.
Right.
And so, I think one thing that I think they should do in schools actually is have a class that they take maybe in their third year, but are graded in their fourth year, at the end of their fourth year, on how well other people could have maintained their code. And with the whole idea of teaching, a concept that I like to refer to as the ship of Theseus. It's this idea that if you replace every developer one at a time across the ages, then you get the ship of Theseus. The software is the same, however, it's been worked on by many interchanging teams, and so that team is the same, but it's comprised of completely different people. So that's been my little rant about it. I don't know if that's
Yeah, it's an
an
interesting
appealing
one.
thought.
Not really thought about the education side of it, but you're right. I mean, it's like TDD is something that you see the light bulb go on for people further down the line when the test is protecting them from some mistake that they realize they would have inadvertently made if it hadn't have been there. So getting over that hump of like, why should I learn how to do this? Why should I put the investment in of doing it now is a difficult thing if you're not getting to follow through and see that reward later on as well. Yeah.
And then there's also there's a similar problem, I think, with entrepreneurs. So if you're a single developer and then you make a piece of software and then it starts making money and you start hiring people, then you have this problem of the founder as a salesperson. So all of a sudden, this technical founder that started with this technical software passes it off to other developers, and the software, because of the lack of context, the software starts to run into the ground while the founder is trying to sell what's there, and even promising new features and guessing that it will take a certain amount of time based on their existing context. And so I think that another incentive against TDD is that you have a lot of these startups come up and they rise from nothing basically on untested code, and then they transition it thinking that they can work that way forever.
So you've obviously done some great work in the BDD TDD world, and then how did that world start combining with the kind of mobbing world for you? What was your journey there? And
yeah, that's a good one.
What's the synergy, I suppose?
So, I mean, like I'm XP like through and through. That's sort of where I came from, right? So like my first proper agile project, probably, where are we, 2000 and I don't know, can't remember now, 5. And we did, like, we really tried to do XP. Jason Gorman was there as a coach. He's a great UK coach, and he was a kind of mentor of mine at the time. And so that's kind of my background. And then when we were working as Cucumber Limited, and this is kind of 2015 really, when we were established as a business, and we started so Cucumber Limited was run as a consulting company really. So we used to go out and make money by doing training courses, teaching people, spreading the good word of behavior-driven development. And then we'd sort of recycle that money into either like working on the open source, or we started investing in a product which we ultimately called Jam, which has got kind of mashed in and rebranded into a thing called Cucumber Studio now at SmartBear. But at that time, there was like 4 or 5 of us who, whenever they were kind of on the bench, as you'd say, from the consulting work, which was a lot of the time actually, because we only needed to do, so much consulting work a month to keep everything on the level. There'd be a core of us of about 4 or 5 of us regularly working together on Jam, and I don't really know where we got mobbing from. Like, it was just a thing that was around at the time. And we were like, well, why don't we try that? And I remember us oscillating from like, we'd sort of tried it for a bit, and then it would drift back into people like doing things in pairs, and then we'd drift and then we'd have a get together and decide, no, this isn't working as well, let's get back to mobbing again. And I think the pattern that we established that worked quite nicely for us all was that we would mob in the mornings, and then the afternoons would be solo time, because one of us was like being the CFO of it was only like a 10-person company. One of us was being the CFO of the company. He'd have to go do spreadsheets in the afternoon, and we'd have to take sales calls with these consulting clients and stuff. So but some people would sort of potter away in the afternoon, like fettling up things that had been getting in the way in the morning, which is really beautiful. So you'd have that space to like tinker about, which is sometimes hard to find in a mob, I think, to work out of sync with other people and just try stuff or fix up something that you'd find a bit annoying, but you wouldn't necessarily want to do it in band. And then you come back and mob together for the morning session, and it'd be like, ta-da, we've got this new little tool that I made, whatever it was. So that was a really nice rhythm that we found there. So that was the kind of heyday, I guess, for me for mobbing or ensembling, was that period where we were working on Jam when we were still independent. When we went into SmartBear, and we kind of combined with the French team who built an app called Hip Test, and that was what we kind of merged together to make Studio. And I think there's been like probably 3 mobs running for a time. It's all kind of changing, but I'm not so involved in those teams now, so I don't know how they're practicing things day to day. But that, for me, that was my kind of mobbing heyday. Yeah.
Nice. Oh, awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, I think that tinkering time, you're right, is really important, and maybe doesn't get the press that it maybe it should. Like we have it built in with learning time, so like everybody, you know, has their mobbing time, and then you have dedicated learning time, which you can decide to do solo or mob, or, you know, it's on also people stepping away. I've seen people step away from the mob, like, look, I see a problem here, I'm going to go tinker, I'll be back, you know. But I think that is really important, and I think that that's good to highlight. And one thing I wanted to ask about was, you know, so, you know, BDD, Cucumber mobbing, and then I've seen recently you posting quite a bit about these kind of inclusive open source mobbing sessions. Do you mind sharing about that? That's been happening on occasion.
Well, so I came back to Cucumber Open in about January this year. Like I'd been working on some of the sort of internal architectural stuff around Studio, and but for various reasons I came back, and I came into this role of co-lead with Aslak, and I sort of looked around the place, and I've not been really involved so much in the open source project for probably like 3 or 4 years. I kind of, you know, kept my hand in and knew the folks, but I've not really been in and around it that much day to day. And I looked around, and the first thing I noticed was like all of the committers are all white dudes, right? All of the regular people that turn up on Thursday mornings for our calls, and they're lovely people, but they're all white dudes. And I'm sure that not all of the users of Cucumber are white dudes, right? So what is happening between somebody being a user of Cucumber, because all of the contributors of Cucumber is like a funnel, right? In open source, that's kind of how I think about it. And I think I got this idea from, I've forgotten the name of the guy that started Homebrew project. He wrote a really good blog post about this. Nathan somebody, I think. Anyway, you can think about it like a funnel. So you have your users, and then you have the people who are using it and sort of start to contribute, whether it's just like telling you about a bug or maybe even fixing a bug. And then some of those people will start to, if you give them the right, merge other people's fixes, right? And then eventually you get the people who are like, they're thinking about it every week, making releases, your real maintainers. And somewhere along that funnel, we're losing the women and the ethnic minority people. Why is that? So that's what we've been sort of trying to learn about this year, really, just trying to figure it out. And I spent quite a bit of time over the summer just turning up to diversity meetups and sharing the problem, really, and just hearing people's experiences about contributing to open source and what it's been like, and reflecting on how kind of basically how quite unfriendly open source projects can be, just because, you know, maintainers are quite busy, maybe a bit stressed out, so trying to turn that ship around a bit, and be really deliberate about how welcoming we are. And one of the things we've started doing is on Fridays, I run this new contributors ensemble. So we put it on Twitch, and it's starting to gain some momentum now. I mean, I've been doing it for probably 8 weeks or something. And it's just a really nice thing to do. Yeah. And I'm not just doing that. I'm also doing, because not everybody wants to, you know, do their first bit of coding on open source live on the internet, right? So I've also been quite liberal with a Calendly link, so people can just, if somebody's interested in getting started, they can just ping me and we book up a session, and just sit down and work out what they're interested in. The great thing about Cucumber is that we've got ports of it in like almost every programming language. So if you're interested in, like, I've been learning Go with this woman called Ariana recently, who that's what she was interested in, and we've got a port of Cucumber which is called Go Dog, which is getting a bit kind of has had a bit of a lack of attention recently. So I've been able to get into that in those sessions, and I learned so much. It's kind of like usability testing, right? Like if you sit on a session with somebody and watch them walk into the GitHub repo and try and find out, you know, how do I pull this down? How do I build it? How do I run the tests? And you realize how crap the documentation is. It's just brilliant feedback. So yeah, it's been great to sort of like help me to put myself, because the thing is, you know, when you're 10 years inside this thing, it's like you've got the curse of knowledge really, really badly, and it's really hard for you to know and put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's new.
Nice.
Absolutely.
But the Friday ensembles have been, I think it's a really good example of how inclusive that kind of work that way of working can be. Like last week we had Blaze on there, who's a Python developer. He doesn't know any JavaScript, and we were working on a JavaScript problem, but he's very much part of the mob, engaging with the problem solving, helping us remember to stay on track. He's perfectly capable of being a valuable member of that dynamic without knowing the nitty-gritty details of how to write JavaScript syntax. And I think it's just a really good sort of good example of how that works, how that dynamic works.
Yeah, I really like what you had to say about onboarding new people and making it easy, and there's a lot to be said for mobs in just how quickly it is to onboard anyone, right? You have somebody with experience, you pass off that experience, that person leaves, somebody else comes in, that new person can now train the other person, and it becomes really fluid for and then you identify issues with the initial onboarding in general. And if open source projects were, many more open source projects were maintained in this way, it wouldn't be nearly as opaque as I think it is now. Yeah, so there's
a thread going on right now. There's a group of people who are building a Rust port of Cucumber right now. And there's one like technical little bit where we have this thing called Cucumber expressions, which is like a kind of variant of regular expressions for expressing the mapping between the plain language documentation and the function that you're going to run in the code. And there's this huge long thread going on asynchronously in a GitHub ticket between Rin, who's on the Cucumber team, who wrote the original Cucumber expressions, and this contributor from the Rust community, and they're just like back and forth. And a couple of times I've gone on there and said, would anybody like to just get together and we could mob on this for an hour? Because like it would be so much simpler. But some people, and I think this is an interesting thing, and I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about this, is like, I've always been so big on pairing, and I love working in an ensemble, and I would kind of like happily just write all my code like that all the time, I think. And yeah, I know it doesn't suit everybody, does it? And I've found that, like, when I've been in coaching places, you can't be too pushy about it. Some people just like that, like they're used to working that way. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, we have a very slanted data set because we interview, our interview process for people who mob with us day in and day out is a mobbing interview. So the interview would probably, and they know it's a mobbing interview coming into it. And so typically we have people who want to mob. And so I think there's only a limited amount of data I have where people are in our kind of culture and they don't want to mob on something, and it's kind of like, oh cool, go do your thing and then come back when you're ready. But I've recently had experiences, not necessarily with code, but just kind of the async sync distinction, where it's like, I see we're doing this async thing, why don't we just get together and figure it out? And there's certain personalities who like it but then fight it, and I kind of see that with most experiences I've had, where they like the kind of synchronous, but then it's like, hey, I need time to just be by myself and think. You know what I mean? Like, let's. And
I think that's an important one, isn't it? And I mean, I'm fascinated by this dynamic between synchronous and asynchronous working, because I think there's definitely space. So, like, I have this story about the best code I ever wrote was me and Steve Tuck rewriting the internals of Cucumber Ruby over a 18-month period. I mean, this is years ago now, like 7-8 years ago, something. And we used to just do it on Fridays. So we used to pair to do it, but we only did it on Fridays. And the pace of that work, like the fact that we had that week in between to cogitate on what we'd been doing. I mean, it could have probably been like 2 or 3 days break rather than an entire week, right? It was just the way our schedules work. We were earning money the rest of the time, and we'd spend Fridays together hacking on this hobby. But there was something about that, the quality of the code that we wrote. I I believe we definitely could not have made it that good if we'd have just forced ourselves to do it every day. We needed that space.
Yeah.
And I feel like because it was a knotty as problem, it was really, really complicated, and it was mired, and kind of to get to where we needed to go, it needed, it was a difficult problem. And so not all of the work was typing in the code. Some of the work was thinking about it and thinking about what approaches could we take. And I think it's fascinating that idea, like, what is the right pace for this problem, and could we actually allow the code to dictate the pace and go and do something else for a bit instead and leave it? I don't know. I think it's we don't always pay the code like the respect it needs in that way. I think we're often too pushed by the commercial demands or whatever of the organization that's paying us to write the code.
You leave it often kind of, if you let it mull in the back of your head, then while doing something else, you can accomplish a lot. And I think that phenomenon presents itself a lot. But I also think that that's a little bit of why we kind of practice the gradual refactoring over time. And especially like if you come back to it, right? And so I think lean development in general, lean software development in general has a lot to say about, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to have enough quality in order to be maintainable in the future. And if you return to it, then you can improve it. And the more times you return to it, the better and better it'll get. But if you never have to visit it again, then it might be too much of an investment. And so, but yeah, I mean, there's definitely like that capitalist, like, cost benefit analysis of where you put your time, and cost of delay prioritization. And so, but I've also been in an environment, because my early mobbing days, what we would do is we had 20 different projects and we would time slice between them. So we would build a feature and then we would leave that project for a significant amount of time. And then so we were mobbing. And it used to be that the 5 people in the mob worked on 5 different things. We all got together and always just started working on one thing at a time.
Yay.
And so the big transition, I think, that happened, and especially in the time slicing, you kind of got that effect. You were like, okay, today I'm working on project 1, tomorrow I'm working on project 2. Yeah, and it was actually multiple projects per day. So it was probably like the morning we spent on project 1, got a release out.
Yeah.
Then the afternoon we spent on project 2, got a release out. And the next morning, project 3. And we would go from anywhere between like 3 to 20 of these in a consecutive period.
It's such a beautiful story though, that, like, when you think about the number of teams I've been to coach them, where you look at their task board and there's 10 developers and there's 10 stories in progress at the same time, and every one of them is working on their own little problem. Why don't they all just work together on one of them, finish it, and then work on the next one together?
And a really big beautiful thing about that was that project 1 had only the developer 1's input, and project 2 only had developer 2's input. And so everybody learned so much about the company in general and quality practices in general from each other, that by the time we did a few loops of that, there were just tons of bugs being eliminated, interdependencies and communication between applications going away, or becoming much more fluid to develop for, and interpersonal interactions improving greatly. And so it just felt right. And so, and I think that's opposed to, perhaps a really large scale product that can suck up all of those people's time, many times over. You kind of just work on one thing, forever until it's done. And so, but you're right. I don't know how to reconcile the two experiences, because I think there is something really beneficial to the time slicing.
Just having permission to give the code some space, basically, and let your heads like noodle on it.
Yeah. And on that note, I was just I've been reading Woody's book on mobbing here and there, and it was making me think about pause, because he was saying quite a bit, and you were there, Chris, so Woody was writing about your experience with that. There, it wasn't just like straight, this code, factory just jamming out code 24/7. It was, there were, he had this list of things, like these were times to pause and for us to just stop and take a break or think and whiteboard for a while. And it's interesting because you were talking, Matt, about I need time to think about this solo. And I think that's totally valuable. And I've seen people do that, whether mobbing or not, or just taking a break from mob. But also I've seen quite a bit in our culture experimenting with, yes, we need to pause and think before we just keep writing more code, but we experiment with thinking together. So we'll draw together, or we'll, brainstorm together, mind map together, lean coffee discussion together. And I'm not saying that's for everybody, because solo time to think is probably very important too, especially for certain personality types. But it's interesting to see that experiment play out. We're like, well, what if instead of thinking separately, we thought together and diagrammed together or something like that? But
there was a big so that diagramming together, I think, really spawned from a situation that we had where kind of equality of voice wasn't happening. So some developers in a ensemble were speaking more than others, just not out of like anything negative. It just was sort of happening. And so they were kind of like, what are some strategies to go through this? And one of the ideas was, everyone draws, right? And so basically it's like, hey, we have this next thing to do. Everybody draw your UML diagram of how the code's going to change next before anybody navigates it, and then we'll compare diagrams together. And that was a really cool thing. And then also the cross team lean coffees has been another thing where people pull away from the mob. One person kind of from each team working on completely separate products, and they just have a general lean coffee today. And everybody has to produce 2 stickies. One is work related and one's not work related, and then you dot vote them and have a lean coffee on those topics. And those things have been really, really beneficial. But yeah, so
nice to have a touch of that out of work stuff in today's remote context as well. Isn't it? It's difficult making the space for that sort of like idle chit chat that you've so easily find time for when you're in the same physical space.
And I think we had started doing the cross team lean coffees in person, but then they became really beneficial going remote. It was really, really good.
It was the thing you mentioned about the drawing. Everyone draws reminds me of a pattern we established, which I think is an interesting one. And I imagine you've also got patterns for this around like options for solutions to a problem. So like, especially where you'd have maybe a couple of more opinionated people who had different opinions about how to implement something. And the pattern we established for that was where, once you could acknowledge that was what was happening, we'd split the mob, and we would go with like the person who had an idea about one thing would go and explore the other idea. We tried to sort of have you go and explore the thing that the least about. And we're going to do that for half an hour, whatever time box looks like the right size, and then we'll come back together and compare what we've learned from that. And it was just fascinating, like what came out of those, because invariably, the third solution that we ended up with was like the best hybrid of the 2 options. It was really cool. But it was necessary to, like, again, give the space to allow those things to get explored a bit. And for us, working on them in parallel felt like a good trade-off, because that's another dynamic. Like I've sort of like moaned a bit about capitalism on this call, but like we were all, because it was ultimately 6 owners of Cucumber Limited, we all owned it equally. We were all business owners and developers of our fledgling product that we were investing in at the same time. So that was a really fascinating thing for us as well, to sort of like have that thing of how much do we want to invest in this really? Do we need to bother writing tests for it? Yes, we do, because that was interesting.
And that seems like a really unique way to have a company, and that's fascinating. And I've had those experiences too, whether we do it serially or in parallel, where we map out, we draw out the different options, and then it's like, okay, this pair is going to go do that one, this pair is going to do that one, then we'll meet, or we do both options all together as a mob, and that's great.
Mob both.
Yeah.
And then there's another pattern, which is if there's a really big skill diversity and people can't agree on the solution, then you go with the least experienced person's idea, unless the more experienced person can convince them otherwise. So all of them, or flip a coin. I've also done flip a coin.
Right. Yeah. But I love that whole idea of strong style. It's just great. Yeah, I mean, this reminds me. So, like, one of the things I wanted to mention and just bring up was, like, in that heyday period, Sally Ann Freudenberg joined us at Cucumber as a partner, and she was in this place where she'd been like this kind of agile consultant, doing lots of keynotes and stuff, but she hadn't been writing any code for quite a few years. But she's a PhD, she's like super bright, had written a lot of code in the past, and she really wanted to get back into it. So she came and joined in that mob as this kind of like, I think I remember her saying, it was like, imagine if you'd, done a bit of singing when you were a kid, and then and you thought you're quite good at it, and then you sort of sat down with all these people and they passed the mic round, and then you realize that you're in this room full of opera singers, and then someone passed the mic to you. I remember saying something like that. But that was a really cool experience, really interesting experience. And like, I think all of us, because we're always remote, like we've always done this remotely. And actually, when Sal onboarded, we all flew to Belgium, which is where a couple of the team were based, and we had a kind of get together in Wavre for a few days and hung out and did some in-person mobbing and getting to know each other. But then we went back to doing it all remote. And Sal and I ended up doing a talk at the XP conference that year in Portugal, in Porto, about the surprisingly inclusive benefits of remote mob programming, just because we'd all kind of realized how, so Sal's autistic, and one of the things she found really great about remote mobbing was how she could just completely control her workspace, right? She could have exactly the environment that she wanted to work in, set it all out exactly how she wanted it. And she could come and go from the mob as she had energy and time to do it. So it's like all of us, she had kids at home, coming and going. And that is, I mean, for me, it's been a phenomenal thing about mobbing, is the way that like the code just charges on, even when you've got to go take a phone call or pick up a sick kid from school or whatever. Like the consciousness just moves forward, doesn't it?
The steamroller effect.
Inexorable. And I still have this fantasy about trying to we tried it. Oh, we never talked about this. Yeah. We tried it on the 10-year anniversary of Cucumber. We tried to do a 24-hour mob.
Yeah.
Woody came along for a little bit. But yeah, like I have this fantasy that you could just build a company around that and just run a continuous mob. Like you have the right people in the right place in the planet, and the code just never stops pumping out. Yeah.
Bob Allen has run some what he called global liquid mob experiments, where I think it's gone on 2, maybe 3 days, where it just keeps going around the world, for a little bit. And so that's pretty cool stuff. And and I think maybe before we close out, because we're about to hit our time box, I think you wanted to hit on vulnerability a bit. What are your thoughts there?
Right. Yeah. Segue. Well, I mean, the thing I think we all discovered at Cucumber when we learned to mob is how necessary it is to be really kind and gentle. And I think that, I mean, we touched on it earlier, like, why do some people not suit or are not comfortable with pairing and mobbing? And the stories I've heard from people who've kind of been converted to pairing, at least, it's really been an experience of like realizing that everybody has to look stuff up on Stack Overflow. It's not just you. And it's fine. And that's an experience of becoming vulnerable, right? Like you're not guarding that shame of, I'm the only person who has to look stuff up on Stack Overflow. Surely everybody else knows all this stuff. You're not guarding that anymore. And I think that's the sort of amazing, like, it's almost like a spiritual thing about mobbing, right? That we love about it, that the atmosphere that it creates at work is an atmosphere where it's just totally okay to not know stuff. And that is a really, really liberating thing to be a part of. But it's also can be challenging for some people, I guess, and you know, I don't like working with people that are sort of guarded and don't like to ask the stupid questions and stuff. It's difficult. It's harder to work with them. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so it's a sort of, yeah, I hope for us all that like more and more people can discover how liberating it is.
Well, I think that a lot of people end up in that place of being guarded, not because they were originally like that. I think that a lot of people in their careers just kind of had it beat out of them. So I run into plenty of mobbers where it's taken years to get them past the negative impacts of previous teams that they've been a part of. And so I think it is like going into that vulnerability piece and working with somebody who isn't being vulnerable. A lot of the times I find myself now asking, like, how did this person get here? Because I actually don't think that that being guarded is like a natural state. I think that that people, like even as kids, right? So you're with a bunch of friends and you kind of tell them everything until you get made fun of for it, right? And then like all of a sudden you learn like this is okay to say and this is not. Yeah. And so, you know, like children, I think are very free in general, and gradually over time they become more and more closed off as somebody, you know, steps on something that they love in some way, right? And I think that happens over the course of people's careers too, because I think what I find is, especially a lot of the people kind of fresh out of college, they go into a mob and it's like all these possibilities explode and they just learn right away that they can be, you know, totally open. But if you take somebody with like a 20-year career where they've only been at companies that have had either, you know, backstabbing or politicking in general, like all of these things were just learned behaviors. And so I find that like an established mob over years will have to walk back and deconstruct all of that like pain, right, to bring them back to a place that they can be vulnerable. But it's kind of a project, and it's really a little bit awful, but yeah. So kind of is my viewpoint on vulnerability a little bit.
Yeah. But I think it's a great, you know, it's a great thing that we do, and it does bring business benefits too. That's the thing. Like this isn't just some touchy-feely nonsense about making it nice to be at work. Like the code that this produces is just way better. And so if that's what your business wants, I guess is the thing. Like if you're an agency that just needs to toss out, you know, quickly things that are going to get thrown away, maybe this isn't the right practice for you. But if you're an investment bank that's building some core bit of your infrastructure that you're going to be putting billions of dollars of trades through, this is definitely the right way to build that code, you know, and it's a nice way for the humans to do it too.
Yeah. And test it so it lasts long, and mob it so it's extensible and high quality, and be vulnerable so the feedback can flow and you can, you know.
I mean, my thing, I don't know, have either of you read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance? Mm-hmm. So I really recommend that book. It's hard work, but it's one of my like definingly characteristic books about one of the biggest inspirational books for me about as a software developer. I think I read it in my 20s, but it really is, and it's like a meditation on quality, like what is quality, and there's this kind of theory in there that quality is something which is baked into a thing based on the kind of joy and enthusiasm that was being experienced by the people as they made it. So it's a sort of like a, you know, spiritual new age nonsense, but it's also it kind of resonates, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You can just feel the quality coming out of something, and it got put in there because the humans that made it were having a good time while they did it.
Yeah, I think the code, when you're reading code, you can sense the emotions that were going on at the time, I think. But go ahead, Chris. I know you had
so I think we're coming up on time here, so we need to wrap up. So to our, so actually, Matt, if do you have anything that you'd like to share or plug before?
I'll just plug Cucumber School, which is like, this is my kind of main project at the moment, is putting out these videos. And if you want to learn about BDD and Cucumber, it's free. But I'm really proud of those videos. They're really good, I think, as a way of learning those practices, and we're porting them into JavaScript, Ruby, and Java and C#. So if any of those are your languages, you can learn how to do BDD from Cucumber School.
Fantastic. All right. So to our audience, if you know anybody that wants to get into a open source project but doesn't know how, maybe or maybe wants to know more about quality, more about ensembling, more about inclusivity, or if maybe somebody who's building a team that wants to be inclusive, then please share this episode with them. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. And thank you, Matt, for being with us.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Bye, everybody.